welcome David Lang. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Pulitzer Prize-winning composer and guest composer for the 17th Biennial Festival of New Music. Maybe we can jump in right. We're going to do 4 pieces of yours, and we can jump in with the last piece on the festival of yours, Pierced.
Mm-hmm.
The University Symphony Orchestra is going to perform. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the piece.
First of all, I'm really happy to be here at Florida State. Thank you very much for having me. My piece, Pierced, comes out of a kind of problem about how it was commissioned and who commissioned it. A lot of my pieces are about solving problems or looking at things that we take for granted, or looking at classical music and questioning things that maybe we haven't questioned and maybe we shouldn't question. Maybe, you know, the questions have been asked years ago and answered to everyone else's satisfaction, you know, but what happened with my piece Pierced was it was commissioned by an ensemble, by a trio, a group called Real Quiet, which is a cellist, a pianist, and a percussionist, and a string orchestra. So the idea was not to do what we normally do with a concerto, where you have one person who is heroically confronting an orchestra, and we have that great sort of 19th century narrative about how, you know, the hero challenges society, and they eventually, you know, the society is changed and overcome by the great power of the ideas of the individual. It was a very different thing. You know, there are these two ensembles that don't need each other, basically. You know, how do you make a concerto out of something that says my world is chamber music and another group that says my world is orchestra? So I thought maybe I could imagine something where it's not that they are in a struggle to see whose ideas will win, but just more like the way society really works, which is that they're coexisting together, and you need information from one in order to decode what is happening in the other. They don't really acknowledge each other. They don't really, a little bit, but not a lot, you know. But basically the idea is that they have two different kinds of material, and they need the presence of the other material for you to understand what their material means. So the idea of this piece is that both of these groups are doing something that lives in a certain world, and you don't really understand what the totality of the world is until you put them next to each other. For example, in the opening section, the strings are playing something which is very harmonically influencing. It has a harmony, it has a direction, it has a way of moving. The soloists are playing something which is very dissonant, and yet you put them together and you feel how they work. So they're not really paying attention to each other, but you need one for the other. The piece is in 2 sections. The second section, for example, the entire orchestra plays something that's very dissonant and intricate and has lots of news. The soloists are playing something which is very tonal, which has harmony, which sounds like chords. And so the odd thing is that putting these two things next to each other makes them understandable in a way that each one by itself would not be. So the reason why it's called Pierced is because it's imagining that there's some wall between these two different worlds. And what's the material? What's the idea which is capable of piercing through this wall? What's the kind of idea which has the power to move from one side to the other? And what makes it move from one side to the other is our attention to it. You know, the solo instruments are playing this very chordal, very harmonic, very tonal kind of music in the second half, which is completely ignored by the string orchestra. And yet we hear the string orchestra in this kind of tonal context. So we're the people who sort of make the ideas pierce from one side to the other.
So it's sort of it's a different take on that, maybe with you might think of a composer as controlling which bits of each of the groups is piercing into the other, and having a very detailed scheme as to how that's going to work. And what you're describing is something more sort of natural to the way we typically operate?
I think composers can operate on lots of levels. You know, composers can worry about the moments of things, you know, what happens at this moment, you know, what happens at this chord or this juncture or where these people collide. Or things can happen on the phrase level, like I change things this way. My pieces actually exist on the totality level. You know, it's like there's one big thing. There's not a lot of internal change in my pieces. You know, things sort of have big blocks of things that they represent, and that's really what they do. So it is possible to imagine how piercing would be something that would happen. I would figure out 10,000 ways for people to collide with each other and for ideas to go back and forth. That would be totally fine, and there are lots of composers who do that really well. That's not the kind of level that I'm that interested in. I'm really interested in going, here's this, you know, giant, you know, kind of monolithic thing colliding with this giant monolithic thing, and I want to smash them together and see what happens. I'm not really so interested in what happens with the local or the small or the detail area. So, I mean, of course, I control all that. It's you know, everything is completely written out, and all the timings are completely you know, prescribed, and you know, I don't believe in leaving anything to chance. So it's not like I'm saying these two things exist and I don't care what happens. I've controlled all those things, but I don't want anyone to pay attention to those things. You know, I think one of the things that's interesting about composing for me is I think it's about how you manage people's attention. It's what you want people to listen to. So do you want people to listen to how great it is right now at this moment? I actually want people to think that the point of a piece of music is to wake up 2 weeks after the concert and go, whoa, that's what that piece was about. You know, that's where I think the action is. I don't think that the action is, here's a beautiful sound, oh, here's a beautiful orchestration, here's a beautiful chord, oh, that detail was really great. To me, that's about where you are at this moment, but I'm interested in something that's, you know, really aimed someplace completely different.
That sort of ties into what I was going to ask next. So the score instructions include, you know, edgy, emotion, and my favorite, the jazzy Zappa phrasing, and intense buzzing tremolo, these sorts of things. And so from my hearing, it's like we've taken a very intense, edgy moment in time, and then we've stretched it out over this 15 minutes. And I mean, there's a couple of sections there. It's really challenging I imagine it's challenging composing with that, to maintain that, and then also for the performers, right, to match that level of intensity. I don't know how you would respond to that. Or
My pieces are are very hard, and they're very hard in ways which are, for classical musicians, peculiar, I think. And I think this is one of the things that that I'm very interested in, is how we get used to a way that classical music works. We get used to a way that that people can rehearse and practice and live, and about the way tension gets built up and released. And so there's a way that we live in classical music, and that works great. You know, this is not a challenge to that. All those decisions were really good. But in Pierced, for example, you know, the instruction for the beginning, there's this kind of jazzy line that happens, which lasts for the first 6 minutes of the piece, completely in unison from the solo instruments, which is unbelievably difficult and unbelievably hard to play. And it says Zappa-like phrasing because, you know, when I was a kid, I was a huge Frank Zappa fan. And one of the things that he did, which was so incredible in the pop music context, was he had really great players, and he rehearsed. And he had these incredible jazz licks, which other musicians would have improvised, but you knew that they weren't improvised because he would have people playing them in unison. And in order to play them in unison so well, you knew his band had to be incredible, and you knew that they had to have put in a huge amount of hours. So to me, that was really a kind of spectacular thing about that music, was to say, I'm in this genre which likes this kind of line and doesn't expect it to do anything other than what it is, and I've put in all this energy that's extra that requires us to do all this hysterical, backbreaking labor in order to make it happen, that you won't appreciate listening to it because you just think that's a cool line moving along. And I've always thought how that represented a kind of powerful commitment from Zappa to what it is he's trying to accomplish. So I wanted to do that in this piece as well. The problem then is you have this blast of energy from these players, which is really hard. It has to last 6 minutes, so they have to keep that energy going from start to finish. It doesn't change. It doesn't get more intense, less intense. It doesn't shade itself. It doesn't become romantic, or it doesn't give one person a chance to bow out and rest for a little bit. It has to be on completely, and because it's in unison, everyone will know if you are slightly off. So the pressure and the tension for the player and the pressure and the tension for the listener is that here's this job that everyone understands that's really hard, and we watch these people struggling to make this thing that we all understand is really hard. So it's a really fantastic, theatrical, emotional, powerful thing that everyone understands, but because it's really difficult, we don't do it. That's not the way we make music difficult in classical music. We make difficult music in classical music in a way that you can practice, in a way that you can rehearse, in a way that you can work hard so that you can overcome something, so that by the time a piece becomes performed, the difficulty is kind of a sleight of hand. And when you listen to Paganini, for example, what you hear is something really difficult that the player can work on and master. And what we see then and experience as a listener is, here's something that was hard. Here's something that was difficult, that was a challenge that I overcome as a player, that I overcame, right? My pieces are not like that. My pieces are hard, and they're hard in a way that will never get easier. And they're hard in a way which I think everyone, in a kind of theatrical sense, participates in. Here is a job which, no matter how many times you've played this piece, it will still be difficult. It won't be something where I'm hiding the fact that I overcame all the difficulties when I rehearsed it, and all I'm showing you now is how great I am that I overcame how difficult this was. My pieces are really hard. I'm really sorry. I think a real professional composer figures out how to make something that is really easy, that looks really hard. My pieces are actually the opposite.
Maybe I'd love to follow up on that, but maybe we should. As a side, it's interesting, like a connection with, say, Fernie-Ho or someone like this, who's doing a similar sort of thing, but yours is like right on the precipice, where you expect people can do it, and you notice when they don't.
Yeah.
As opposed to
I actually think it's okay to see someone struggling in a concert. I mean, I remember when I was really young and I went to the Aspen Music Festival, which I went to the Aspen Music Festival 5 times when I was a student, and I went to every single rehearsal of every single orchestra. I had such a great time there. And I noticed this really great thing is whenever a soloist broke a string in a concert, that soloist got a huge round of applause, at the end. The idea that something tragic and, potentially devastating happened that changed the course of the music. Whenever that happened, whenever you saw that disaster strike on stage, all of a sudden it became riveting for the listener, So I started wondering, if you were a soloist, why wouldn't you try to break a string every show? Why wouldn't you just put that into your repertoire? So I think in a lot of these pieces, I want that kind of energy, the sense that what you're seeing is not something which can be polished, but you're seeing that a kind of piece which is an ideal, which maybe nobody can realize properly. And what you're watching this kind of incredibly human attempt to get as close to this ideal as possible. And everyone knows when you're in the audience that this person is working really hard to get there, and that's the kind of human and emotional connection to the listener. That here's this thing that we can't accomplish, So it becomes sort of like the rest of our lives, Like I wish I could be a better husband or a better dad, or I wish I could be, a better citizen, or I wish I could, be smarter every day, or I wish I could be more honest, or I wish I could be kinder to strangers, or whatever. It's like our lives are full of these things where we know what perfection is, and our life is a struggle to actually try to live that way, and none of us can because we're human. So to me, the really beautiful thing about having something which is that difficult is that seeing that struggle reminds us of the way we live, or at least it reminds me of the way I live.
Maybe we can talk about a different kind of musical attitude that still has to be maintained, and talking about human kindness and suffering, and we can talk about the Little Magical Passion. And you could maybe just tell us a little bit about the commission, but you were able to choose the text yourself, and why you chose that, and what you did with it, and why.
Okay. So this idea about how to sort of challenge yourself to be a better person is the kind of underlying story behind my piece, The Little Magical Passion. The story behind this was I got a commission from Carnegie Hall to work with the great choral personality and conductor Paul Hillier. And so what happens to me when I get a commission from somebody I don't know that well? I mean, I knew him a little bit, but I didn't really know him that well. And so what I do is I drink a huge amount of coffee. I buy every single recording that I can find. So, I went, I bought, probably 40 records of Paul Hillier, and I just sat and I drank coffee and I listened to them. And I knew Paul Hillier as somebody who was involved with his relationship with Cage and Arvo Pärt and Steve Reich and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. I knew him as a completely modern person who contributed to the music of the 20th century. And I bought all these CDs, and I was surprised, maybe not that surprised, but most of the music that he has been involved with in his life has been music that is about Jesus, because that's where our vocal tradition comes from. So if you're a Western musician, if you have a nice voice and you want to sing choral music and you're singing in the Western context, you are going to spend a lot of time extolling the virtues of Christianity to strangers. That's what your life is going to be about. So here is this modern man who I knew from his connection to contemporary music. And yet even this modern man, most of his output is about advocating for Jesus. It's not a surprise, and it's something that, you become aware of very early as a classical musician, that you spend a lot of time in this world. What's weird about it for me and for people like me is that I'm not a Christian. And so, and you always, come across this when you grow up in the Western tradition, that you come across a piece of Bach that's incredibly beautiful, and you feel that this is the greatest composer ever, and you feel his passion and his commitment, and you feel that he knows exactly what he's doing and can express it to you, and he's completely in touch with how to use every single thing at his at his disposal to control his relationship and your relationship to Jesus. But there's a point past which I can't get because I don't believe in Jesus. So what do? Normally, you try to avoid it. You find other subjects to write about, you let it slide, whatever, or you can console yourself with the idea that that piece is about his passion or his commitment or his belief and how great it is that he can show that. I thought maybe this was the time finally to deal with this. So I wondered if there was a way to make a piece that would be in a religious vein, a religious context for this piece, but sort of about what Christianity was about, but without having Jesus in it. So if I could tell the story of the Gospels, the part of the Gospels I could identify with, the idea that you see someone suffering in front of you, you see a crowd not paying attention to the suffering of that person, and you ask yourself, why is it that crowd is not helping that poor sufferer. Could I be a better person? Could I notice that person's suffering? Can noticing another person's suffering put me in touch with a community of people which challenges ourselves to be better than that crowd that didn't notice that person's suffering? And to me, that's the essence of what the gospel is about. You know, that's what, to me, the story of, say, the St. Matthew Passion would be about if you could take Jesus out. It's looking at the suffering of someone and saying, let me help you. Why am I not better? Why is this poor person, why do I live in a world that lets this person suffer? You know, of course, I live in New York, and, you know, there are people suffering all around me all the time. I can't walk to the subway without ignoring a homeless person, without ignoring a poor person, without looking at someone who clearly needs my help and who I could clearly help, but I can't. Why is it, you know, that we have this world religion that's based on noticing that person, but we don't help that person? So I wondered how to deal with that somehow, and the idea that I came up with was to take my favorite crowd scenes from the St. Matthew Passion, the texts, not the music from the Bach St. Matthew Passion, but my favorite scenes where people are noticing the suffering of Jesus, take Jesus out and put someone else's story in. And I didn't know what story to do, and I tried everything I could think of. I tried obituaries from the New York Times, and I tried, you know, historic stories of, you know, plague victims, and I tried lots of different kinds of things. And finally, as my deadline was coming up, my wife said, well, what about the little match girl? That's a miserable and pathetic story. And so I thought, yeah, that's really fantastic. That's a great idea. So I took the story, the Hans Christian Andersen story of the poor little beggar girl who sells matches on the street to make a living, and who starves and freezes to death in plain view of everyone in her community, and no one notices. And I took her story. I took the very first translation into English of the Hans Christian Andersen story, and I said it word for word from beginning to end, and I intercut it with my favorite scenes from the Bach, and that's how that piece came about.
It flips what I had thought would have been the sequence of events. Like, you would have started with the Little Magical Passion, and as you were working with it, then this connection, this larger connection changed. I didn't realize that actually what started this was Jesus and Bach and this, and it was kind of the Little Magical Passion, the Little Magical story, sort of the focal point in a way, or at least the immediate focal point. This is sort of later, last-minute addition to it.
It really fits into what I was saying earlier about how my pieces are really about solving problems with classical music. That's really where everything comes from, you know. I was not supposed to be a classical musician. There was no music really in my family growing up, and I went to college as a chemistry student to go to medical school. And so that I am a classical musician has always been a surprise to me. And even though, of course, you know, I'm deep into it, and I have a doctorate in it, and I teach at Yale, and my nerd coefficient is very high. But I think because I began someplace else, I've always looked at classical music, I think, as a little bit of an outsider, trying to think of the conventions of things in that world that we take for granted. We take for granted that that if we want to sing together, we are going to sing about Jesus. So, and I, growing up, you know, I've sung the B minor Mass, I've sung Handel's Messiah. When I was in college, I was in a Gregorian chant choir that went on Sundays to sing in a Catholic church. I played trombone growing up, and I had a steady gig playing in a brass ensemble in an Episcopalian church. You know, we take it for granted that classical music is about dealing with the legacy of music that comes from Jesus. So it's totally understandable why that happens, because that was our great first employer. That's where people needed music. That's where music was paid for. That's where music was valued. And so that's the place that nurtured our world that became the world we know now. So it's completely understandable that that's where we came from. But because I came from someplace else, I'm I'm aware of the fact that that's strange, you know. And if our world had begun some other place, if the things that we valued had been about something else, we wouldn't have that repertoire. We wouldn't have that background. We would be singing about something else.
Maybe at this point we can, maybe it would be good. Another piece on the program is from very early, Illumination Rounds, from 1981. So you were maybe finishing up master's
Yeah.
program or something. And so maybe we could use this as a chance to talk about that piece, but maybe just sort of who you were, that's like over 30 years ago, and sort of how you, I don't know when the last time was that you may have even heard that piece
I
live.
haven't heard it for a while, yeah.
So Friday, you'll hear it live,
Yeah.
and have this shock of recognition of
Yeah.
you know, yourself. And so what, maybe you could just talk about that progression from where you were then,
Yeah.
and you know, you were a student then, and now you are this celebrated composer who's teaching at Yale, and
Right.
any of that you would
Okay.
talk about.
One of the pieces on this festival is my piece for violin and piano called Illumination Rounds. This is a really early piece of mine. I wrote it when I was 23, I think. And I wrote it when I was a student at Yale, so I was a master's student. And I wrote it basically to show off. I mean, I wrote it, it was a commission from two friends of mine who were doctoral students at Juilliard. So one was a violinist named Leslie Shank, who was getting her doctorate and now is a concertmaster at St. Paul Chamber Orchestra or whatever. And one of them was the pianist John Kimura Parker, who has gone on to a great career as a soloist. And I got this commission, and I thought, they're going to play this piece in Carnegie Hall. They're really great players, and they can do anything. So my job is to show off the fact that I know how to make them do anything. You know, they can play something really hard. So I should make something really hard for them. I should make them play something really flashy, really difficult, that shows off all of their abilities and all of their talents and makes people scream for them. And of course, the other point was to show off that I knew how to make people play this hard music and how to make the hard music that would make them look good. So it's a very student kind of idea. You know, you don't really know what kind of music you're going to write as a career. You don't know where you're going to find yourself. But it turned out to be a really important piece for me because I wrote this piece. It's very flashy. It's very hard. And it's called Illumination Rounds, and I was trying to pay attention to just the technology. You know, it's like, if they can do this with their fingers, you know, how do you make a piece that just concentrates on the fact that you're doing something really difficult, regardless of what that difficult thing is or does? And so I thought maybe this is a little bit the way people who manufacture things are, where you have an engineering problem to solve, and you solve that problem regardless of what kind of moral implications you have for that problem. You're actually trying to find an elegant solution to a problem without paying attention to the moral problem. And I thought, you know, because this was right after, you know, we were still 1981, right? You know, so it's like everyone was still involved with, you know, the legacy of the Vietnam War, which I had become very obsessed by in the 70s. And so I, and I had a friend who had gone on from Stanford to do work which was sort of in the defense industry, so it was sort of on my mind. And I started thinking about weapons technology, that there are problems that come up in weapons manufacturing that need to be solved, and the solutions are done by geniuses, by incredibly smart people who are trying to figure out how to solve a problem. And those problems can be beautiful and can be elegant and can be even philosophical. And yet the reason why they're trying to solve these problems is divorced from the moral implications of what those problems, you know, do. This problem in particular was, I had read a book that was talking about the problem of helicopter gunships fighting at night in Vietnam. How do you go in to evacuate people, you know, who need evacuation late at night when you can't see anything? How do you know where you're shooting? How can you see if you're shooting if you're shooting properly? So what they did is they invented a kind of bullet that lit up afterwards, that left a phosphorus trail. And the thing that's really kind of beautiful and philosophically elegant about this, I think, is that what the engineers said about this was, it solved the problem because what you do is you aim not the bullet, but you aim the trail. You can see the resonance of where that bullet has been, and that's what you aim. So, so I love that idea that what you're seeing actually and what you're paying attention to is not the thing itself, but the shadow of the thing, and that's what is the content. That's what solves the problem. So I thought, here is this incredibly elegant solution to this problem of how do you kill people more efficiently at night, which seems pretty horrible, but I guess necessary. So I wondered if I could use that distance between the thing and the shadow of the thing as a way of modeling a piece of music. So what happens in my piece is that you have something which is clearly the bullet, clearly the very intense thing, and then the thing that colors that thing, or shadows that thing, or trails off that thing, or follows that thing. And which one you are supposed to pay attention to is the thing which changes its balance throughout the course of the piece. But the point of the piece is to show off. The point of the piece was to figure out a metaphor which would allow me to do something that was really difficult. And the reason why this piece ended up being really important to me was because when the piece was over, it was a big success, it was a big hit, and I got a lot of work after this, so that when I came out of graduate school, I had a huge amount of work, which was great because people, famous people called me up and said, oh, that was a really difficult and obnoxious piece. Can you do the same thing for me? And I got really paranoid when that was over, because I started thinking, did I write that piece because I wanted people to like me, or did I want that piece because it was exactly what I wanted to hear? Did I write that piece because it was honest to the thing I was curious about, or did I write that piece because I knew it would make someone look good? And so after that, opened up this whole multi-year self-searching period for me, where I wrote a lot of incredibly weird music that was about trying to figure out really how can you be sure that what you are doing is honest? How can you say, well, I made this thing not because I wanted to make someone look good. I made this thing just because I wanted to see what happened if I did it. So I went through a period of saying, anything which makes anybody look good is dishonest. I have to get rid of that. I have to cut everything out that's ornamented or flashy, or that makes anybody look excited or look exciting. I have to cut out anything that is about managing someone's emotional response. I only have to concentrate on things which I can be guaranteed when I look in the mirror are the things that I'm curious about. But that's what happened, is I think the piece was very, very successful, and it did a very good job on so many of these things, on so many of these levels, that I had to figure out, well, which of these levels are the ones that are honest to me, and how do I make sure I only live there?
I feel I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about one last thing, which is Ursula Oppens will be here,
Yeah.
Which is very exciting. And so on that concert, Friday night, she's doing Elliott Carter, Night Fantasies.
Right.
And then your set of piano forehand works, Before Gravity, Gravity, After Gravity, and David Kalhouse, who's a faculty member here and a former student of Ursula's.
Oh, fantastic.
Will be playing with her.
Yeah.
So that's great. And then the second half of the concert is the Zhevsky.
Right.
So I mean, to be very quick,
Yeah.
we've gone a lot longer than I think we were thinking. But what might you say about that? I don't know if she has played these pieces before, and I'm really interested to hear Night Fantasies and then your pieces right after. I think it's a really nice juxtaposition, or maybe not. I don't know.
Well, one of the funny things about this program is that I met Ursula Oppens because she played and recorded the piano part to Illumination Rounds. So that's how I met her, was because she ended up playing and recording the piano part two illumination rounds, which is super hard, and which I have to say she was amazing at. So I'm very excited to work with her. That's actually the last time I worked with her, was all those years ago. So those little four-hand pieces, I wrote a piece called Gravity, which is actually an arrangement of a choral piece. Excuse me while I scratch my nose. Sorry, we can edit that. Sorry. I wrote a piece called Gravity for piano four hands, and it's actually an arrangement of a choral piece that I had done. And I wrote it, I had written this thing and it had this beautiful little tune, and I just thought, you know, when you have singers, their vocal range is like this, because, you know, that's what the human voice does. And I had always imagined, it has this descending line that goes from top to bottom, and I always thought, you know, it's so eternal, it needs to go from higher, from, you know, beyond this range of human hearing down below this range of human hearing. And I always imagined how great it would be if it could have that kind of scope. So when I got a chance to make it for pianos, I took it. And it's a very beautiful and simple and little tiny thing. And the weird thing about short pieces is they create a world just the same as large pieces. Large pieces, you work really hard to create this universe around them, and small pieces, you do the same thing. But with small pieces, they're very fragile because they're going to be on a program with another piece that has a different kind of world and another piece that does something else. And so if you make something that has a little tiny world, it's kind of an orphan. So I wrote this piece, and I loved that world so much that I thought, well, I wonder if it's possible to prepare yourself to be in that world. So I wrote a piece that prepared you for it. And then I wondered if you could actually have a piece which would take you someplace else after having been in that world. So I wrote a piece called After Gravity. And even that's not enough. So I imagine all the time, you know, that eventually I will write pieces which will be about preparing you to be in the world, to be prepared to be in this one little moment, you know. And I like that that's not the way we do things in classical music. You know, we do things in classical music by saying, here is a movement which exists to be itself, and it is followed by a movement which does something else and maybe has a reason to follow that first movement, but it is its own thing. But I really love the sort of Russian doll or, you know, onion nature of things that says, here's a little gem, and how can you prepare yourself to appreciate that little gem? And how can you listen to something that's only about remembering how great that little gem was, you know? It's a very different way from the way we imagine, you know, how the classical music experience is supposed to work.
Yeah. I can imagine an after gravity that at some point becomes the before gravity.
Which would be fantastic, yeah. That's a great idea, actually, you know, and then, and you don't need any more music, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It'd be like the Scriabin pieces.
I like that.
Well, thank you very much, David Lang, for taking time. It's been really enjoyable to hear you talk about your
Thank you
music.
very much, Cliff. That was fun.